Before I begin this review, I'd like to deliver a quick PSA about how it's a bad idea to bunch up with your teammates. Here's why.
Just do it!
So Iran got itself another event vehicle, and like the Persian Tomcat before it, the FV4030 Shir 2 is pretty good, though it does have a few issues which we'll discuss. And by the way, when I call this vehicle Iranian, this vehicle was built in Britain, being a sort of in-between between the Challenger and the Chieftain, built to Iranian specifications, though they were never handed over because of certain events that happened, which you may have heard of. Now though, we get to see this lovely machine in War Thunder, where it can make life an absolute living hell for 8.7. And speaking of battle ratings, you might rightfully be wondering what this thing is doing at 9.7 when, at first glance, you could be forgiven for thinking this thing might be comparable to something like a Leopard 2A4 or an Abrams. Well, while I do still suspect this may go up in BR in the future, let me just say it has some drawbacks. Getting into that, let's take a look at armor protection. Starting with frontal protection, you may start to see that the armor scheme on this thing is a little bit odd. Against kinetic rounds, you may notice that the turret cheeks are quite strong, but the upper front plate isn't going to resist much more than the absolute weakest rounds you might encounter in a full down tier, and a number of different areas don't seem to really be armored at all. Of all the weak spots, by far the worst is the lower front plate, which is just a 70mm RHA plate, and by the way, for those of you keeping score, that makes it thinner than the side armor of a T-54. It is huge and very easy to hit, and means that your 60-ton state-of-the-art MBT can be reliably frontally penetrated by a Panzer IV. But wait, it gets better, because what do you suppose is behind this massive weak spot, other than the driver? All of your ammo, because of course it is. This means that if you're used to driving vehicles like the Leopard 2 or the Abrams, you're going to want to mentally prepare yourself for the joys of, instead of just getting damaged, getting constantly ammo-racked basically any time you receive a penetrating hit. In terms of chemical protection, it's basically the same story, except the upper front plate is actually effective, at least. Looking at side armor, yet more unpleasant news awaits us, with the lower side hull armor being only 38mm thick with a 19mm aluminum screen, leaving you vulnerable even to 20mm autocannon fire. Basically, just do not angle this tank. Pretty much any kinetic round you encounter will be able to melt through your side armor even at very extreme angles. There is a bit of a bright spot in terms of chemical protection though, as while the hull still isn't going to stop any sort of high-powered heat FS, the side turret is actually pretty effective against them, especially when angled, so I guess that's something. After hearing all that, you may not have the best impression of this vehicle, but it is at least primarily good news from here on out. In terms of firepower, your top round is going to be the L23 APFSDS round with a maximum flat pen of 410mm and a velocity just over 1500 meters per second. Also worth noting is that this vehicle has a very fast 5-second ace reload speed, though that is only with your 3-round first stage ammo rack, with subsequent rounds being loaded slightly slower. This is obviously quite impressive firepower for the BR, with the L23 round being more than serviceable even in a full up tier. One thing I will mention though is that the spall on this round felt very inconsistent. Sometimes it seemed to just randomly not spall almost at all, whereas usually it would explode like a bomb after penetration. Maybe this was just some weird coincidence, or maybe this is because the shell is a bit light compared to many other comparable dart rounds of this caliber, but in any case, it happened enough times to me to feel like it was worth mentioning. Anyways, next let's talk mobility. The Chieftain family of tanks is not exactly known for its zippiness, but this thing quite surprised me with its outstanding speed and acceleration. With a horsepower to ton ratio of almost 20 and a reverse speed of over 22 miles per hour, this tank feels very responsive, and it was hard to hold myself back from trying to run and gun with it, which you really shouldn't do due to the whole, terrible armor thing. Lastly, let's talk about lineups. This is one area where this thing falls a bit short, with the Ruacat being the only other 9.7 available in the British tech tree as of right now, and honestly, that not being a vehicle that complements this thing very well, given that neither really makes for an especially good second spawn. There aren't really any vehicles at lower BRs which you'd want to drag up either, quite frankly, though you do at least get some options in terms of CAS. In this regard, you get two different kinds of Harrier variants to pick from, a Jaguar and a Buccaneer. None of these vehicles get anything other than dumb bombs and rockets, though, other than the bullpups on the Buccaneer, which are of questionable effectiveness at this high of a BR, though they do all, of course, have a full suite of ballistics computers for their guns, bombs, and rockets. Overall, not the strongest lineup, but I mean, at least it actually has one, I guess. So, final verdict, what do I think of this vehicle? I know I've ragged on this thing quite a bit, and also, to be honest, I'm really not a big fan of these British tanks, which are more optimized for hull-down sniping, as I much prefer a more aggressive playstyle, but even so, I find myself quite impressed with this thing. The firepower is obviously outstanding, and the mobility really lets you fully exploit advantageous positions, with the great turret armor giving you a huge leg up over your opponents in a long-range gunnery fight. When you're actually able to pull this thing into a hold-down position and snipe like it's designed for, it is absolutely going to stomp the competition. Obviously, it still has its drawbacks, but overall, I still give this thing a solid 8 out of 10, with the main points holding it back being the fact that it's not particularly versatile, it doesn't have a very strong lineup, and also being constantly ammo-racked makes me want to shove my head through my computer monitor. I really hope we get to see more vehicles like this in future events, because honestly, it ends up being these sort of just weird, obscure export variants and weird prototypes that end up being the most fun for me, even compared to like big ticket items such as the F-15 or the F-16. Iran specifically, but also other countries in the region like Pakistan and India have a bunch of really interesting export and domesticated variants of foreign vehicles that we could see in the future, and I really hope those are on Gaijin's list. Anyways guys, that's going to be all for this one. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out the playlist linked in the description if you want to see more similar ground RB content. I appreciate it, and I'll see you guys in the next one.